Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world of chrome-trimmed refrigerators, cigarette smoke in the produce aisle, and a peculiar national obsession with gelatin. We're talking about grocery shopping in 1950s America. Not the nostalgia version, not the soft focus, pastel-coloured, everybody's smiling version you've seen on vintage greeting cards. The real version. The one where your mother drove 40 minutes in a car with no air conditioning to buy a can of something called mock turtle soup and considered it a triumph. Before we go any further, a huge, genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you made my week. I love when suggestions come in because it means you're invested in this, and that means everything to a channel like this one. If you enjoy what I do here, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy it. No pressure, no guilt. Just come back if it made your night a little softer. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is, because I find it genuinely fascinating that someone in New Zealand and someone in Ohio are both lying in the dark listening to the same thing right now. You can also find us on Spotify now. Links in the description if you'd rather listen while you drift. Now, dim those lights, pull that blanket up, turn on a fan if you've got one. That soft white noise does something to the brain that nothing else quite matches. Get comfortable. Settle in. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to grocery shop in 1953? Did people enjoy it? Did they dread it? Was there a moment of genuine wonder the first time someone saw a frozen TV dinner in a supermarket freezer case, glowing under fluorescent lights like some kind of miracle from the future? What did the store smell like? Was the butcher someone you knew by name, or just a man in a bloody apron who judged your roast selection without saying a word? Did housewives actually look like the ads? Pearls and heels and a serene expression while comparing two identical cans of condensed soup? Or were they exhausted and slightly resentful, just trying to get home before the baby started screaming? What happened when you couldn't afford the cut of meat you needed? Did you improvise? Did you substitute? Did you pretend? Could you really feed a family of 5 on a single paycheck and a coupon from the Sunday paper? Or was that just something people said to make the era sound heroic? And, most importantly, why was everything in a can? Why was Spam considered aspirational? Why did Jello appear in savoury dishes? Who decided that mayonnaise was a condiment and a dessert ingredient, and apparently a structural element? And was anyone, at any point, actually happy about this? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1953 America. It's Tuesday morning, your kitchen smells like percolated coffee and something faintly metallic. There's a list on the counter in your own handwriting, and you're about to go grocery shopping. Good luck. Let's start at the beginning, not at the store, at the kitchen table, the night before, with a stubby pencil and a notepad that probably also has a phone number and a recipe for a casserole you've never made written on it somewhere. In 1950s America, grocery shopping wasn't something you did impulsively. You didn't duck out on a Wednesday evening because you were craving something specific. You planned, you budgeted, you made a list, and that list was a document of both aspiration and quiet resignation. You wrote down what the family needed, cross-referenced it with what was on sale in the circular that came folded inside the newspaper, factored in what was already sitting in the icebox, and then made a series of small, practical compromises that added up to the weekly shop. This was a woman's domain almost, entirely. Surveys from the era suggest that somewhere around 90% of grocery shopping was done by housewives, and the pressure to do it correctly, efficiently, economically, impressively, was woven into the fabric of the whole thing. There was a system. There was always a system. You organised the list by aisle if you were serious about it, which many women were, because wandering inefficiently through a store was not just inconvenient, it was a small personal failure. Produce first, then meat, then dairy, then the long corridor of canned goods, then bread. Some women reorganize their lists every week to match the layout of a new store. Some women use the same list format for years, a kind of weekly template filled in fresh each time. The budget sat beside the list like a chaperone. Average household grocery spending in the early 1950s ran somewhere around $20 to $25 a week for a family of 4, which sounds manageable until you remember that was out of a paycheck that had to cover the mortgage, the car, the utilities, the children's shoes, and whatever else the week required. Every item on that list had already been cost evaluated before it made the paper. The name brand versus the store brand. The larger can that cost more up front but less per serving. The cut of beef that was on special this week, and whether it was on special because it was a good deal or because something was slightly wrong with it. The women's magazines helped. Good Housekeeping and Better Homes and Gardens ran monthly features on how to feed a family of 4 for $15, complete with suggested menus, coordinated shopping lists, and cheerful photographs of casseroles that looked significantly more appealing than they would turn out. The list in the magazine was aspirational. The list on your notepad was real. You copied some of one onto the other and arrived at something workable, and then there were the coupons, clipped from the Sunday. Newspaper with actual scissors, stored in an envelope or a rubber band or a small accordion folder, if you were especially organised, carried to the store and presented at the register with the quiet efficiency of someone who had earned this discount through labour and forethought. Couponing was not embarrassing in 1953. It was sensible. It was the behaviour of a person who paid attention. You finished the list, reviewed it once, and set it on the counter by the car keys. A well-managed grocery list was a point of quiet pride. A sloppy one was a kind of failure. The list sat between you and the store like a script, and you were expected to follow it. Modern grocery shopping involves standing in the cereal aisle for 11 minutes holding your phone while reading reviews of granola. The 1950s housewife would find this completely baffling and also deeply shameful. Before you even touched a shopping cart, you had to get to the store, and in 1950s, America, this was its own small drama. The car, if your family had one and not everyone did, was your ticket. Big, heavy, with a dashboard that looked like the inside of a spacecraft and absolutely zero safety features worth mentioning. No seatbelts, no rear-view cameras, no power steering in many models. Just a lot of chrome, a lot of optimism, and an engine that made sounds a modern mechanic would describe as a cry for help. The car was also the project. The 1950s automobile was not a neutral object. It was a statement about prosperity, about modernity, about America's confidence in its own future. Families saved for a new car. Families argued about which car. The car sat in the driveway like a declaration, and driving it to the grocery store was, in some small way, a performance of the life you were living. But the car required the suburb, and the suburb required the car. This is the loop that the 1950s locked itself into with remarkable speed. As developers, built new housing tracts outside city limits, identical houses on curving streets with young trees barely thicker than your wrist, the stores followed. Not the small neighbourhood grocers that had served the old neighbourhoods on foot, but the new supermarkets, built for volume and for parking, located at busy intersections surrounded by asphalt. To get to your groceries you drove. There was no other sensible option. If you didn't have a car, and in the early part of the decade, a meaningful number of American households still didn't, you made arrangements. You shopped at the nearest neighbourhood grocer, which was closer but smaller and more expensive. You caught a ride with a neighbour who was going anyway. You sent a child ahead with a list and a precise amount of change and the instruction not to lose either. You budgeted your trips because each one was a production. Shopping day was typically once a week, usually in the morning when the store was less crowded, usually on a Thursday. or Friday when the weekend's larger meals needed to be planned for, you dressed for it. Not formally, this wasn't church, but presentably. Curlers were acceptable preparation for the trip, but not acceptable at the store. A house dress and a cardigan, sensible shoes, hair set the night before. You didn't go to the grocery store looking like you hadn't tried. The store was a social space. You would see people. The children sometimes came. This was a calculated risk. Children in grocery stores in 1953 behaved in roughly the same way children in grocery stores behave today, which is to say, unpredictably at volume, with a strong tendency toward the candy display and an unerring ability to touch every item on the lower shelf. You managed them. You negotiated with them. You made quiet, firm threats that both parties understood would not be fully enforced. And then you pulled into the parking lot, vast, gleaming, slightly disorienting in its openness, and gathered yourself. The list was in your purse. The cart was at the entrance, waiting. The week was about to be stocked, one aisle at a time. Walking into an American supermarket in the 1950s for the first time was reportedly an experience close to religious, not because the food was transcendent, we'll get to the food, but because of the sheer, staggering scale of it. Supermarkets were new, not brand new, but new enough that they still carried a faint charge of novelty, a sense that this was the future and you were living inside it. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, crisp and merciless. Linoleum floors reflected everything back at you. The shelves were tall, the aisles were wide, and there was just so much. Row after row of identical cans, towers of cereal boxes, pyramids of produce carefully stacked. Music played softly, some pleasant, forgettable melody designed to slow your pace and open your wallet. The checkout lanes gleamed. The shopping cart, a relatively recent invention still, being refined, rattled pleasantly beside you. The cart itself deserves a moment. Sylvan Goldman, an Oklahoma grocer, had invented the folding shopping cart in 1937, but early adoption was rocky. Shoppers resisted them, apparently finding the act of pushing a large wire basket vaguely undignified. Goldman reportedly hired people to wheel carts around his store to demonstrate normalcy before customers would follow suit. By the 1950s, the cart was accepted. It had evolved. It was bigger, sturdier, and had a small fold-down seat at the front for children, which solved the problem of where to put a toddler and created the entirely new problem of a toddler with arm's reach of every passing shelf. The supermarket of the 1950s was built on a principle that the era called one-stop shopping, which was genuinely new. Before the supermarket's rise, a household's weekly food supply required multiple stops: the butcher for meat, the bakery for bread, the greengrocer for produce, the dairy for milk, the deli for cold cuts. Each stop had its own hours, its own prices, its own social conventions. The supermarket collapsed all of this into a single trip, under one roof, with standardized prices on every item. It was efficient. It was convenient. It was, in its way, a form of compression, taking an entire neighborhood's worth of food commerce and squeezing it into 50,000 square feet of climate-controlled space. Coming from the era of the small neighborhood grocer, where you handed a list to a man behind a counter and he retrieved things from shelves on your behalf, the supermarket felt like being handed the keys to something enormous. You could choose. You could compare. You could pick up a can of something you'd never heard of, read the label slowly, and put it back without anyone saying a word. The freedom of it was real. The manipulation of it was also real, though no one was quite talking about that yet. Store designers had learned, empirically, through watching where customers walked and what they bought, that the layout of a store was itself a selling tool. The produce section near the entrance, because fresh, colourful vegetables created an impression of abundance that set the tone for everything that followed. the staples at the back, the temptations at eye level. The whole environment was calibrated carefully and deliberately to guide the shopper through as much of the store as possible before she reached what she came for. You walked in with a list, you left with the list, and also a few things that hadn't been on it. The store had been designed with precisely that outcome in mind, and it worked, reliably, every single week. Let's talk about the butcher, because in 1950s America, the butcher counter at the back of your supermarket, or at the dedicated butcher shop if your neighbourhood still had one, was not just a place to buy protein. It was a social institution. The butcher knew your name. He knew your family's preferences. He knew that your mother-in-law was coming for Sunday dinner and that you needed something that would impress her without actually costing what impressive things cost. He knew that the children didn't like anything with too much fat on it and that your husband preferred his steaks thick. He had assembled this knowledge over weeks and months of transactions, the way any skilled professional assembles knowledge of their clients, through attention, through memory, through the simple act of showing up every week and paying close attention to what people actually needed. He would steer you. He would advise. He would sometimes, if he liked you, slip a little extra into the paper for the same price. This was not corruption. This was the social economy of the butcher counter, an informal system of favour and loyalty that ran alongside the official price list and made both parties feel that the transaction was about more than money, which it was. Meat was expensive, proportionally far more expensive relative to household budgets than it is today, and choosing the right cut required a kind of weekly negotiation between what the recipe called for, what the budget allowed, and what was available. Ground beef was the workhouse, cheap, versatile, forgiving of the home cook's limitations, capable of becoming meatloaf or meatballs or a hamburger patty or a hamburger and noodle casserole with a can of cream of mushroom soup involved. Chicken was cheaper still, though it carried a faint stigma of austerity in the early part of the decade. Beef was aspirational. A standing rib roast for Sunday dinner was a statement that things were going well. Pork occupied a complicated middle position. Bacon was universal and beloved. Pork chops were a reliable weeknight option. Ham was festive and somewhat expensive, and various other pork products filled the lower budget spaces in the weekly menu with the unpretentious functionality of something that simply got the job done. Lamb was available but considered an acquired taste. Veal appeared in more ambitious cookbooks than it did in most shopping carts. The butcher wrapped everything in white butcher paper, folded with a practiced efficiency, and sealed with a strip of tape. He wrote the contents and the weight and the price on the outside with a grease pencil in handwriting that ranged from neat to cryptic. You tucked the package under your arm or into the cart and moved on, with the specific satisfaction of having handled the most expensive item on the list and come away with something good. The supermarket butcher was beginning to replace the standalone butcher shop through the 1950s, and something was lost in that transition. The supermarket butcher was an employee, not a proprietor. He had less investment in your satisfaction, less flexibility in his pricing, less authority to make the small, unofficial adjustments that had made the neighbourhood butcher feel like a resource rather than a vendor. The counter was the same, the paper was the same, but the relationship was thinning already in ways that would continue for decades. Here is something that will require a moment of adjustment. In 1950s, America produce was seasonal, genuinely, unapologetically, inflexibly seasonal. There were no strawberries in December. There were no mangoes in Minnesota. There were no pre-washed, pre-spun, pre-bagged salads glistening in a refrigerated case. What was available was what grew nearby, or what could survive the truck journey from somewhere warmer, and survive is a word used loosely here. Tomatoes arrived bruised and apologetic. Lettuce was iceberg, almost exclusively, because iceberg could take a punch. Bananas were a reliable exotic luxury, one of the few tropical fruits available year-round by this point, thanks to the aggressive infrastructure that United Fruit Company had spent decades constructing. Apples were everywhere in autumn and were everywhere, noticeably absent in summer. Corn was summer only, sweet and short-seasoned and one of the genuine joys of the July produce section. Peaches and plums came and went in a matter of weeks. You bought them when they were there, in quantity, because next week they might not be. The produce section of a 1950s supermarket was modest by modern standards, a relatively small area near the entrance, with perhaps a dozen varieties of vegetable and perhaps 15 kinds of fruit at the height of the season, tapering to considerably less in the depth of winter. And yet it was treated with a kind of reverence, because fresh vegetables were understood to be perishable, valuable, and the sign of a well-managed household. You touched things. This was not only acceptable but expected. You picked up the tomato and held it, felt for give, checked the colour, brought it close and smelled it if you were serious. You squeezed the peaches lightly. You peeled back a corner of the corn husks to check the silk. You hefted the melons and knocked on them with your knuckles and listened for the particular dull thunk that indicated good ripeness, as opposed to the hollow thunk that indicated you'd be cutting into disappointment on Saturday. The produce man, yes, there was usually a produce man, watched all of this with the patient, evaluative gaze of someone who had seen people squeeze tomatoes for 30 years and still couldn't fully explain why. Winter presented its own particular produce reality. Come January in most of the country, the produce section contracted dramatically. Root vegetables dominated: potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, parsnips. Cabbage kept well and appeared frequently. Canned vegetables stepped in to cover the gap, which is part of why canned peas and canned green beans were so embedded in the era's cooking. They weren't a choice so much as a solution to a seasonal problem that presented itself reliably every year. Frozen vegetables were beginning to supplement this. By mid-decade, Birdseye had been selling frozen peas and corn since the 1930s, but fresh remained the preference when available. A housewife who substituted frozen for fresh when fresh was available was making a small statement about her priorities, and the era had opinions about that. The produce section was the most honest part of the store. It could not be standardized the way a can could be standardized. Every apple was slightly different. Every head of a lettuce had its own particular density and moisture. You had to pay attention, evaluate, decide. In a store designed to remove friction from the shopping process, the produce section insisted on a little friction. It demanded engagement. It rewarded people who knew what they were looking at. And it punished, without mercy, anyone who bought a melon without knocking on it first. If the 1950s American grocery store had a soul, it lived in the canned goods aisle, row upon absolute row of gleaming tin cylinders, stacked with the precision of a military operation, labelled in cheerful fonts with pictures of vegetables that looked significantly more vibrant than the vegetables inside them. Canned goods were not a compromise in 1950s America. They were a triumph. They were modernity in cylindrical form. They meant you didn't have to put up your own vegetables anymore. That exhausting, summary, slightly dangerous process of boiling jars and sealing lids and praying the seal held, praying nothing fermented wrong, praying the whole shelf in the root cellar didn't quietly become a health hazard over the winter. The can had done it for you, industrially, consistently, safely. The can was a small, affordable, shelf-stable miracle, and the 1950s housewife treated it with corresponding respect. Campbell's soup alone offered something like 21 varieties, and was treating them all as culturally equivalent. Tomato, chicken noodle, cream of mushroom, clam chowder, beef with vegetables, vegetarian vegetable, each in its familiar red and white can, each at roughly a dime, each capable of becoming lunch in the time it took to open the can, add a can of water or milk, and heat the result over a medium flame. Campbell's had also figured out something important about the cream of mushroom soup specifically. It was not merely soup, it was infrastructure. A can of cream of mushroom soup was the binder, the sauce, the shortcut at the centre of approximately 40% of the era's casserole recipes, and everyone knew it. The casserole was itself a 1950s cultural achievement, a complete meal assembled from whatever was on hand, baked in a rectangular dish, and presented to the family as dinner, with a confidence that the presentation helped sustain. Green bean casserole, green beans, cream of mushroom soup, French's fried onions, tuna noodle casserole, egg noodles, canned tuna, cream of mushroom soup, frozen peas, breadcrumb, topping. The specific magic of these dishes was that they asked very little of the cook while delivering a complete protein, a vegetable, a starch and a sauce in a single baking dish that was also its own serving vessel. Fewer dishes, less mess. Dinner at 7. Done. Beyond Campbell's, the canned goods aisle offered Del Monte's vegetables and fruit cocktail, Libby's pumpkin and corned beef hash, Hunt's tomatoes, Spam, which occupied a category somewhere between canned meat and aggressive optimism, baked beans in several interpretations, tuna packed in oil, which was the standard before water packed became available, mandarin oranges in light syrup, which appeared in salads at a frequency that still defies simple explanation. There was also the canned soup hierarchy to navigate. Condensed soups required a can of liquid added. Ready-to-serve soups did not. Condensed was cheaper and occupied less shelf space. Ready-to-serve was slightly more expensive and considered mildly more luxurious. You chose based on the budget and based on how much you trusted yourself to not forget to add the water, which was a more common problem than the Campbell's company would have preferred. The canned goods aisle was also where the list could expand unexpectedly. You came for cream of mushroom and tomato paste, and left also with a can of something called chop suey vegetables that looked interesting, and a can of fruit cocktail because it was on sale. The aisle invited browsing in a way that produce did not. Everything in produce needed evaluation. Everything in canned goods was identical to the last one you bought, reliably exactly what the label promised, requiring no evaluation at all. You just chose whether you wanted it, and then it went into the cart. If canned goods were the beating heart of the 1950s supermarket, frozen foods were the nervous system, still developing, occasionally unpredictable, but humming with tremendous potential. The frozen food section occupied a relatively small but disproportionately exciting stretch of the store, lined with long white chest freezers or upright cases that breathed cold air and glowed with a kind of otherworldly pallor beneath the fluorescent overhead lights. Frozen vegetables had arrived first. Birdseye had been selling them since the 1930s, and by the early 50s they were accepted, if not yet celebrated. Frozen peas were genuinely better than canned peas, a fact that even devoted canned goods partisans quietly acknowledged. Frozen corn on the cob was a reasonable approximation of the summer experience in February. Frozen orange juice concentrate, introduced commercially in the late 40s, had become a breakfast institution. You kept a can in the freezer, you mixed 3 cans of water, you stirred, you poured, and breakfast had juice without peeling a single orange. This was progress. This was exactly what progress was supposed to look like. But then came the TV dinner, introduced by Swanson in 1953, reportedly inspired by an overstock of post-Thanksgiving turkey and a logistics problem that needed solving. The TV dinner was a complete meal, compartmentalized neatly in a segmented aluminum tray, designed to be slid into a 400-degree oven for about 25 minutes and eaten directly from the tray. The original version, turkey with cornbread dressing, gravy, sweet potatoes and peas. The price, 98 cents. The name alone was a cultural signal that deserves its own moment of appreciation. They didn't call it a convenience meal or a quick dinner or a prepared entree. They called it a TV dinner, and in doing so they named not just a product but a social shift. The acknowledgement that Americans were now eating in front of the television set, that the dining room was sometimes being replaced by the living room, that family dinner had loosened its format and was still working out what it wanted to be. The aluminum tray mimicked the compartmentalized trays used on airline flights, which in 1953 was still a glamorous enough association to be a selling point. You were eating like a person who took airplanes, on a Tuesday, in your living room, in front of Dragnet. This was not diminished. This was modern. Sales of Swanson's TV dinner reached 10 million units in the first year. Other brands followed. The frozen foods case expanded to accommodate them. By the mid-50s, the freezer section had grown from a small novelty area into a legitimate destination within the store, a place you planned to visit, with a section of your list dedicated to it. The future had arrived, and it was cold and slightly institutional, and absolutely delicious when you were tired and didn't want to cook. The housewife who served a TV dinner, it should be noted, received no credit for this. The meal prepared itself. The oven did the work. There was nothing to compliment her on, nothing to ask about the recipe, no visible labour to appreciate. She had opened a package and set a timer, and this was, quietly in the logic of the era, a small domestic failure dressed up as convenience. She probably didn't see it that way. She was probably just relieved. Dairy in 1950s. America was simple in product and complicated in meaning. Milk was whole, always. The concept of low-fat or skim milk being a desirable product was still some years away and would have struck most 1950 shoppers as roughly equivalent to selling leat water. You bought whole milk. You drank whole milk. Your children drank whole milk at every meal, at school, at every opportunity, because milk was calcium, and calcium was bones, and bones were the structural requirement for the children who would eventually grow up and carry the country forward. Milk was not optional. Milk was practically patriotic. Most households still had milk delivered. The milkman arriving before dawn, glass bottles clinking in the wire carrier on the front step, empty bottles left out the night before to be collected. The dairy aisle in the supermarket carried milk for those who'd run out between deliveries, or who didn't have delivery service. But for much of the decade, the milkman remained a parallel and preferred system. He knew how many you needed. He adjusted for holidays. He left a note if the delivery had been changed. He was another of the service relationships that the supermarket, for all its convenience, could not quite replicate. Butter was butter. Purchased in the familiar 4-stick pound package, salted or unsalted, used with a generosity that later decades would regard with something between nostalgia and alarm. Butter went into everything. Butter went on top of everything. Recipes from the era call for amounts of butter that a modern reader has to reread twice to confirm are not typos. They are not typos. The 1950s home cook used butter the way a modern cook uses olive oil, as a baseline, a starting point, the fat around which everything else was organised. And then there was margarine. Margarine was the controversy of the dairy aisle, and it was a controversy that generated more heat than its product category would seem to warrant. It was cheaper than butter. It was aggressively marketed as modern, heart-friendly and practical. Butter lobbyists fought it with a territorial fury that suggests they understood exactly what was at stake. Some states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, other dairy-producing strongholds, actually prohibited the sale of yellow-coloured margarine. You had to buy it white and pale and deeply unappealing in a package that included a small capsule of yellow food colouring that you kneaded into the mass yourself until it reached an approximation of butter's colour and a deeply unsatisfying approximation of butter's dignity. This requirement existed until the last states repealed it in the early 1950s, and even after the stigma lingered. Serving margarine instead of butter was a small social tell. It said something about the household's budget that the household might have preferred not to say. Serving butter was a minor luxury and a minor statement of adequacy. The dairy aisle every week invited you to make this choice, and you made it based on the budget and on how much you cared what people thought, which in 1950s America was often quite a lot. Eggs were purchased in cardboard cartons of 12, examined through the carton's small perforations or opened briefly at the store to check for cracks, carried home carefully, and refrigerated immediately. Cheese was primarily cheddar, sharp or mild, and Velveeta, which occupied a peculiar position somewhere between cheese and a material that civil engineers might find interesting. Bread in 1950s, America had achieved a texture that no previous civilization would have recognized as bread. It was soft, almost aggressively, triumphantly soft. Pillowy, yielding, uniformly, sliced, encased in wax paper with a colourful twist tie that children across the country learned to leave lying open on the counter. Wonder Bread had been building strong bodies since 1930 with its enriched nutrients, and by the 50s it was everywhere. Not just available, but dominant, the default bread against which other breads were measured and generally found unnecessarily complicated. To understand Wonder Bread is to understand something specific about what post-war America wanted from its food, which was reliability, softness, no surprises, and the reasonable assurance that science had checked it and approved it and added several important vitamins to it just to be certain. Wonder Bread was enriched with niacin and iron and thiamine and riboflavin. This was printed on the wrapper with the confidence of a product that had been improved by laboratories. The bread wasn't just bread, it was optimized bread. It was bread that had been thought about by professionals. The softness was not accidental. Industrial bread baking had refined the process of making bread that compressed to almost nothing under slight pressure, and then expanded back to its original shape, creating a product that was technically bread in every measurable way, and yet felt in the hand like something a cloud had made on a day when clouds were feeling accommodating. A slice of Wonder Bread could be compressed to roughly the thickness of a playing card, rolled into a tight cylinder, and then released to unfurl back into a slice of bread. Children did this regularly. It was one of the small, reliable pleasures of the era. The bread aisle also offered rolls in several configurations: hamburger buns, hot dog buns, dinner rolls in a bag, and rye bread, which was available and carried the faint aura of a city deli, something your uncle might buy in a neighbourhood where the delicatessens were good. Whole wheat existed and was considered slightly medicinal, the bread equivalent of eating, something you weren't sure you were supposed to enjoy. Sourdough, artisan loaves, crusty European-style bread, these were not present. These were, in a sense, not yet necessary, because the problem they solved was not yet widely understood to be a problem. The bakery in the back of the store, increasingly common through the decade, offered fresh-baked goods in a limited range: white bread, occasionally a fruit bread or a coffee cake, dinner rolls on Friday afternoons ahead of the weekend. The smell of it drifted forward into the store from the bakery section in a way that was so obviously and deliberately appealing that it barely needs comment. The supermarket knew the smell of fresh bread did something to people. The bakery was not located in the back because that was the most convenient placement for the equipment. White sandwich bread carried school lunch in its soft interior. It held the peanut butter and the jelly. It held the bologna and the mustard. It held the American cheese and the lettuce. It asked very little of whatever it contained and gave very little back, but it was present, reliably, every single day, in every lunchbox in every school in the country. The bread aisle was not glamorous. It was fundamental. and fundamentals in 1950s America were exactly what the country was building itself upon. Walk into the cereal aisle of a 1950s supermarket, and you were entering a propaganda operation aimed squarely at children, executed through the medium of colourful cardboard boxes and the extraordinary new distribution channel of television. The cereal companies of the 1950s had made a strategic decision, the kind of decision that seems obvious in retrospect and revolutionary in the moment, which was to stop marketing cereal to adults and start marketing it to children, through the children's programming that was rapidly colonizing the new television sets appearing in American living rooms. Tony the Tiger arrived in 1952. The Trix Rabbit debuted in 1954. Snap, Crackle and Pop had been around since the 30s, but found their fullest cultural expression when they migrated to television. These were not merely advertising characters, they were personalities, recognizable, consistent, beloved by children with an intensity that parents found difficult to argue with in the cereal aisle on a Saturday morning when everyone was tired and the box was only 43 cents. The sugar content of these products was extraordinary and openly celebrated. Sugar frosted flakes, sugar corn pops, sugar crisp. The word sugar appeared in the product name as a feature, a promise, a selling point, because sugar was still the future in 1953. Sugar was sweetness, and sweetness was pleasure, and pleasure was what the post-war prosperity was supposed to deliver. There was not yet a medical or cultural consensus that the amount of sugar in children's breakfast cereals was a concern worth labelling. The cereals had names. The names contained the word sugar. The children ate them, and no one convened a committee. The prizes inside the box deserved their own moment. Cereal boxes in the 1950s offered premiums, small plastic toys, decoder rings, cut-out cardboard figures, miniature activity sets, buried inside the cereal or available by mail if you sent in the box top, along with a small amount of money. The box top premium system was a masterwork of child psychology. It created a reason to buy the cereal that was entirely separate from the cereal. The child was not buying breakfast. The child was buying a decoder ring that happened to come with some frosted cereal around it. Parents bought them because children demanded them, and children demanded them because the television told them to, and the television was new and trusted and speaking with the confident authority of something that had been invited into the home. The television set was a family purchase, a household investment, a piece of furniture in many cases, large, wooden-framed, positioned in the living room with the furniture arranged around it. What it said carried weight. And what it said, every Saturday morning, was that sugar smacks were the most exciting thing that had ever happened to breakfast. The adults in the cereal aisle had their own options. Cornflakes, grape nuts, shredded wheat, all bran, products that made no promises about excitement and delivered on that promise completely. These were serious cereals for serious people who understood that breakfast was fuel and not an entertainment event. They came in plain boxes with small, dignified typography and no mascots. They tasted like something that was good for you, which in 1953 was not yet the selling point it would eventually become. A bowl of cereal in the morning with cold whole milk, complete, modern, fast, and for the child at the table, accompanied by a cardboard character on the box who was looking right at you with enormous cheerful eyes, telling you that today was going to be great. The deli counter in a 1950s supermarket was a stage, and the man behind it was a performer. Sliced meats were laid out behind glass-like artifacts. Bologna, salami, olive loaf, head cheese, something called pickle and pimento loaf that defied easy categorization, but was apparently popular with people whose taste buds had survived the war and emerged with unusual priorities. Lunch meat was serious business. The American lunch, the brown bag lunch, the school lunch, The desk lunch was built around sliced meat between two pieces of bread, and the deli counter was where that foundation was poured. This was not a peripheral concern. This was the centre of 5 lunches a week, multiplied by every person in the household old enough to chew without supervision. Getting the deli order right meant getting the week's lunches right, and getting the week's lunches right was part of a larger project of household management that allowed no casual errors. Bologna was the workhouse of the deli case. Dense, round, mildly pink, faintly mysterious in its ingredients, Bologna was the meat of the American school lunch in a way so complete that it bordered on cultural definition. Children ate it. They ate it without complaint, mostly. They ate it on white bread with yellow mustard and a piece of iceberg lettuce, and considered this a reasonable midday meal because it was, and because the alternative was going home for lunch, which was not always possible and not always better. Ham was the upgrade, more expensive, more flavourful, carrying the faint prestige of something that had once been the centrepiece of a holiday table and was now being sliced thin and democratised into Tuesday's sandwich. Salami was for families with pretensions, or for families with Italian heritage for whom salami was not a pretension at all, but simply lunch. Olive loaf, Bologna's peculiar, cousin, studded with green olives and pimentos, was for people who had developed specific opinions about what lunch should contain and were not interested in being talked out of them. The process of being served at the deli counter had a rhythm that regular customers knew, and newcomers had to learn. You waited. You watched the person ahead of you complete their transaction. When the man behind the counter looked at you, you gave your order, not tentatively, not with excessive deliberation, because the deli counter was not a place for people who hadn't decided yet. You said, a half-pound of bologna, sliced thin, a quarter-pound of salami, not too thin. He repeated it back. He began slicing. The machine made an extremely satisfying sound, a steady mechanical whir that meant the order was in progress, that the transaction was moving forward, that lunch was becoming real. He laid the slices across the scale with a practiced hand, watching the needle adjusting. He wrapped everything in white paper with the efficient movements of someone who had done this thousands of times, folded the edges neat, sealed it with tape, wrote the weight and price in grease pencil on the outside in handwriting that was either beautifully legible or completely indecipherable, depending on the man. You thanked him. He nodded. You moved on. There was something transactional and also strangely dignified about the whole process. You were a person with a specific need. He was a person with the specific skill to meet it. The exchange was clean and honest and left both parties satisfied in a minor but genuine way. The deli counter asked you to know what you wanted before you arrived, to state it clearly, and to trust that the man with the machine would deliver it. This was, in the 1950s, a reasonable model for a great many things. The checkout experience in a 1950s supermarket was a full-body athletic event, and the cashier was an athlete. There were no barcode scanners, no beeping, no self-checkout kiosks standing in silent judgment of your bagging technique. Each item was lifted, examined, and rung up individually on a mechanical cash register that clacked and dinged with every entry, producing a sound that was both satisfying and slightly ominous, depending on how many items were still in the cart. The cashier knew the prices. This bears repeating because it is genuinely remarkable by any modern standard. The cashier, typically a woman, in the larger supermarkets of the era, had committed to memory the price of every item in the store, or close enough to every item that the gaps were minor. She knew that Campbell's tomato soup was 10 cents, and that the larger can of Del Monte peaches was 31 cents, and that the price of ground beef had changed last week, and what it had changed to. She carried this information the way a skilled tradesperson carries the knowledge of their materials, not consulted, just known. available instantly at the moment of need. She moved fast. The rhythm of the checkout was established and maintained by her pace, and her pace was brisk. Items came out of the cart, passed through her hands, were registered, and moved down the counter toward the bagger, a separate person, often a teenage boy who packed the paper bags with a practiced efficiency that followed its own logic. Heavy things on the bottom, fragile things on top, bread never under anything, eggs handled last and placed with care. Paper bags, always paper, large, brown, with squared bottoms that allowed them to stand upright in the trunk of the car. They held a remarkable amount before surrendering, though they could be defeated by moisture or by an overly ambitious bagger who decided a 14-pound bag was structurally plausible. When they failed completely, the bottom giving way at the worst possible moment, usually in the parking lot, usually when both hands were already full, usually with the eggs. The total appeared only at the end, displayed on the register's mechanical counter, in large numbers that clicked into position as the final sum was calculated. There was a moment, always a moment, between the last item being rung and the total appearing, a brief pause during which the shopper performed rapid mental arithmetic and either felt relief or a specific sinking recalibration of what she had bought versus what she could actually spend. You paid in cash. This was the only option at most stores through the majority of the decade, cash or a check if the store knew you well enough to trust your account. Credit cards existed in a limited form by the mid-50s, but were not yet a feature of the grocery store checkout. You handed over the bills, the cashier made change from the register drawer with the practiced speed of someone who did not need to think about it, and the transaction was complete. No receipt emailed to you, no digital record created, no loyalty points accumulating invisibly in an account you'd forgotten you had. Just the change in your hand and the bags on the counter and the quiet arithmetic of what was left in your wallet versus what was left in the week. The cashier was already looking at the next person. You gathered your bags and moved on because the line behind you was real and the parking lot was waiting and dinner still needed to happen. Prices in 1950s America would make you feel things. Ground beef, around 50 cents a pound. A loaf of Wonder Bread, about 18 cents. A dozen eggs, 60 cents. A pound of coffee, somewhere between 80 cents and $1. A gallon of milk, about 90 cents. A can of Campbell's soup, a dime. A pound of butter, about 70 cents. Pork chops, around 60 cents a pound. A whole chicken, somewhere under $1, sometimes considerably under. These numbers seem laughably small until you apply them to what people were actually earning, and then they become something else entirely, something more recognizable, more sobering. The median household income in 1953 was approximately $4,000 a year. That is the number before taxes, before the mortgage, before the car payment, before the utilities and the insurance and the children's shoes and the dentist and the unexpected things that made the monthly budget a document of intentions rather than certainties. A family of 4 spending $20 a week on groceries was spending roughly a quarter of its income on food, a proportion that feels enormous now and was simply the reality then. The housewife who managed the weekly grocery budget was doing math constantly. Not occasionally, not when it seemed necessary, constantly. In the store, she was running a mental tally as she shopped, tracking the approximate total against the amount she had allotted for the week. She knew the price of things without looking at the tag, because she'd bought them enough times that the prices were simply part of her knowledge of the world, the same way she knew the names of her neighbours and the schedule of the school bus. The name brand versus the store brand was a live question every week. The store brand, already appearing in many supermarket chains by the mid-50s, typically packaged with minimal design and labelled simply with the store's name, was cheaper, often meaningfully cheaper. Whether it was equivalent in quality to the brand name was a matter of genuine household debate. Some women bought store brand canned vegetables without a second thought, Others felt that serving store-brand soup was a kind of statement they weren't prepared to make, at least not at the dinner table. Coupon clipping was not a hobby. It was a rational, reasonable response to the actual economics of feeding a family. The Sunday newspaper arrived thick with inserts from grocery chains and food manufacturers, and those inserts were read. The coupons were cut out with actual scissors, sorted by category or by store, stored in an envelope or a small accordion file that lived in the kitchen drawer specifically for this purpose. At the checkout, they were presented without embarrassment, because there was no cultural script in 1953 that framed coupon use as something other than good sense. The woman who managed her grocery budget well, who came home with everything on the list, stayed within the week's allotment, found the sale items, used the coupons, and still put a complete dinner on the table every night, was performing a sustained act of financial management that the era's culture consistently failed to name as such. She was called a good homemaker. She was called thrifty. She was not called a financial manager, though that is precisely what she was, operating without a spreadsheet, without an app, without anyone acknowledging that the skill she was exercising had a name. Somewhere between loyalty programs and mild collective insanity lived the great 1950s, trading stamp phenomenon, and if you didn't live through it, you are genuinely missing something that no modern reward point system has quite replicated. Not because the rewards were better, but because the physical, tactile, slightly obsessive process of accumulating them was its own peculiar form of domestic theatre. Here is how it worked. You made a purchase at a participating grocery store, and through the 1950s the number of participating stores grew steadily until it became unusual not to participate, and for every 10 cents spent you received a small paper stamp. These stamps were the most famous of which were issued by the Sperry and Hutchinson Company, and called S&H green stamps, named for their colour, which was a specific green that became as recognisable as any brand colour in the country. You took the stamps home, you licked them, you pressed them, one by one, into small paper booklets provided for this purpose, arranging them in rows across the pages with the methodical patience of someone who understood that every stamp was a fractional contribution towards something real. The licking was, in retrospect, a considerable commitment. Each stamp was small, and the adhesive was not generous, and the booklet required many stamps, and the stamps were individually tiny, and the full experience of filling a booklet was a slow, slightly unpleasant, deeply satisfying accumulation of minor effort. Some households used a damp sponge. Some households simply licked. Some households assigned the licking to children, which was either a reasonable delegation of labour or a mild form of child cruelty depending on your perspective and how many booklets were waiting. When you had enough booklets, and enough varied depending on what you wanted, because the rewards came in different denominations of booklet value, you took them to a redemption centre. The redemption centre was a store that existed solely to exchange booklets for merchandise, and it was stocked with the items from the S&H Green Stamps catalogue, which was distributed to households and treated with something approaching the reverence usually reserved for the Sears catalogue. A toaster, a set of dishes, a lamp, an electric mixer, a bicycle for the children, a set of luggage for the vacation you hadn't yet planned. These things were real, achievable, visible in the catalogue photograph, waiting at the redemption centre for the person with enough booklets. Booklets were stored in kitchen drawers and kitchen cabinets, and a dedicated junk drawer that had stopped being a junk drawer and become entirely a stamp overflow area. The catalogue was consulted regularly. Progress was tracked. The waffle iron that required 47 booklets was 47 booklets away, and every grocery receipt moved you fractionally closer. Other stamp programs competed, blue chip stamps on the West Coast, plaid stamps in other regions, various store-specific programs that operated on the same principle. The Grocery store that offered the best stamps could attract customers on that basis alone, because the stamps transformed every grocery purchase from a transaction into an investment. The Campbell's soup wasn't just dinner, it was 3 stamps. 3 stamps were one small step toward the electric can opener. This was not rational exactly. The stamps were worth roughly 1% of the purchase price in redemption value, which is not a spectacular return. But the psychology of physical accumulation, of licking and filling and watching the booklets stack up in the drawer, made the return feel more immediate, more personal, more earned than any abstract percentage could. The grocery store had found a way to make shopping feel like saving. And in a decade that valued both the appearance and the reality of thrift, that was an extraordinarily effective thing to have found. The supermarket floor plan in the 1950s was not designed by someone who was trying to make your life easier. It was designed by someone who was trying to make you walk past as many products as possible before you reach the ones you actually came for. This distinction matters, and the people who designed the stores understood it perfectly, even if the people shopping in them did not. Milk and eggs, the items that brought most customers through the door most frequently, were almost always positioned at the back of the store, far back, past the cereal aisle and the canned goods and the bread and the condiments and the entire diagonal length of the store. To get to the things you definitely needed, you walked through everything you might be persuaded to need, and the persuasion was environmental rather than verbal. Nobody told you to pick up a can of fruit cocktail. The fruit cocktail was simply there, at eye level, brightly labelled, next to the other canned fruit, and you picked it up and put it in the cart because it was there and because it was only 23 cents and because the label had a picture of a bowl of fruit cocktail that looked genuinely pleasant. End caps, the displays at the head of each aisle, featured specially promoted items, often sale items, positioned to be visible from the main corridor of the store. These were not the items that needed to be there. These were the items that benefited from being there, items whose sales increased measurably when they were placed in a position of visibility rather than buried in the middle of their aisle. The end cap was prime retail real estate, and the stores charged food manufacturers accordingly for the placement, though this was not something either party advertised. Products for children were stocked at child height. This is not a coincidence and does not require elaborate explanation. A box of sugar-frosted flakes at adult eye level is a box of cereal. The same box at the eye level of a 6-year-old is a conversation that will happen in the car on the way home and possibly in the store itself and will likely result in the box entering the cart. The store designers knew this. The cereal manufacturers knew this. The 6-year-old was simply operating according to the system that had been built around them. Impulse items clustered near the checkout lane, small, inexpensive, easily justified. Gum, mints, a candy bar, a magazine with a recipe on the cover, a small toy for the child who'd behaved during the shopping trip, or, alternatively, the child who had not behaved and needed to be managed into compliance before the cashier witnessed further scenes. The checkout lane was the last opportunity the store had to add to your total, and it was organised accordingly. None of this was secret in the sense of being hidden, but it was not yet widely discussed in the terms that consumer advocates and behavioural economists would eventually use to describe it. Shoppers in 1953 were not thinking about choice architecture, they were thinking about dinner. The store, meanwhile, was thinking about both. The list in your purse was your defence against the store's design. A woman with a firm list and a firm budget was harder to divert than a woman who'd come in with a general sense of what she needed and expected the store to help her figure it out. The list was not just an organisational tool, it was a negotiating position, and the store had been designed by people who had studied what happened when the negotiating position was soft. It is impossible to talk about grocery shopping in 1950s America without talking about the women who did it, and the weight, not just the literal weight of the bags, though that was also considerable of what the task represented and what the culture built around it. The housewife was the household's purchasing agent, nutritionist, budget manager, and culinary director, and grocery shopping was the main supply run for all of those roles simultaneously. She was expected to know what was nutritious, what was affordable, what the children would eat without complaint, what her husband preferred, what was impressive enough for company, and what could be stretched across multiple meals without anyone noticing that last night's roast had become today's hash and tomorrow's soup. She was expected to do all of this cheerfully, efficiently, and without appearing to find it burdensome. The difficulty was meant to be invisible. The competence was meant to look effortless. The women's magazines of the era were the training manuals and the grade reports for this role simultaneously. Good Housekeeping, Better Homes and Gardens, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's. Each one arrived monthly with articles on how to plan a week's worth of meals from a single marketing trip, how to get more from your food dollar, how to use leftovers creatively, as though leftovers were an adventure rather than evidence of calculation, and how to present the results to your family in a way that suggested abundance rather than management. The recipes that accompanied these articles were built around the reality of 1950s grocery shopping, in ways that are illuminating if you read them closely. Many called for canned goods not as a shortcut but as an ingredient, normalized into the recipe the way a modern recipe might call for olive oil or garlic. They accounted for the seasonal limits of the produce section. They were structured around the cuts of meat that were affordable and available, not around the cuts that were most delicious in the abstract. The recipe was a practical document, and the magazine was a practical guide to a practical life, dressed up in aspirational photography and cheerful typography. The shopping cart was also a public document. What you put in it said something about your household, its size, its budget, its aspirations, its management. A cart full of name brands and fresh produce communicated one thing. A cart full of store brands and day-old bread communicated another. Women were aware of this. They were aware that other women in the store could see their cart, could draw conclusions from it, could form opinions. The grocery store was a social space, and social spaces have audiences, and audiences in 1950s suburban America were attentive in specific, quiet ways. The physical labour of the shopping trip was real and unacknowledged. Pushing a loaded cart through a full store, lifting bags into the car, carrying bags from the car into the kitchen, unpacking, organising, storing. All of this was simply part of the day, unremarkable, unseen, expected. It was not the kind of labour that generated comment or appreciation. It was the kind of labour that generated, when done correctly, the absence of comment which in the domestic logic of the era was the closest available equivalent to praise. The shopping cart was hers. The list was hers. The budget was hers to manage, even if the money came from elsewhere. The refrigerator that was full at the end of the trip was evidence of her competence. The family that was fed was evidence of her success. None of this was called work. It was called being a good wife. The distinction mattered enormously, and almost nobody was making it. Let's be honest about where men fit into the 1950s grocery store, which is, occasionally conspicuously, and almost entirely at a loss. A man accompanying his wife to the supermarket on a Saturday morning was either a subject of mild curiosity or a mild disruption, depending on his behaviour, and his behaviour was usually at least slightly disruptive because he had not been trained for this environment. And it showed. He stood in the wrong place. He picked up items and examined them for longer than necessary, as though the label on a can of corn contained information that required genuine analysis. He expressed opinions about brands that were not welcome because the brand decision had already been made weeks or months ago based on price and reliability and the results of the last time she had tried the other brand and the family had noticed. He asked questions. He made suggestions. He wandered. Some husbands were sent ahead to a specific aisle with a specific sublist. This was the deployment of a resource in a controlled environment. If he was in aisle 7 looking for coffee, he could not simultaneously be in the meat section suggesting a more expensive cut. The controlled deployment strategy was not discussed openly as a strategy. It was framed as helpfulness. But anyone who has ever sent a disoriented person to do a bounded task in a large store knows exactly what it was. Men who shopped alone were a separate category. The bachelor, the widower, the husband whose wife was travelling or ill, the man who had, for whatever reason, been left to supply the household himself. These men moved through the supermarket with the specific energy of someone who understood that they were operating outside their primary competence and had decided to manage this through decisiveness rather than deliberation. They did not linger, they moved at pace. They selected the most recognisable versions of everything: Campbell's, Wonder, Folgers, whatever the television had told them was the right answer, and they moved to the checkout before the situation could become more complicated. The bachelor's cart was a sociological document, a collection of canned things, arranged without particular logic. Beer, some bread, a package of bologna that would last all week and would be eaten in the same configuration, on white bread, with mustard, standing over the sink every single time. Perhaps a frozen dinner, because the frozen dinner asked nothing of him beyond the operation of an oven timer. Perhaps a box of cereal, because cereal required only milk and a bowl and a spoon, and all of those things were achievable by a person of even modest domestic ambition. The grocery store was, in a very real sense, designed for and by a particular model of the household, one where a woman managed the food supply, and a man's role in the food supply was primarily financial. The store's marketing, its layout, its relationship with women's magazines, its hours of operation, even the design of the shopping cart itself, all of it assumed a primary user who was a woman running a household. The man in the grocery store was a visitor to a space that had been built around someone else, navigating by instinct and television advertising, and the vague memory of what his mother used to buy. He usually made it out. He usually got most of what was on the list. He usually forgot something. He forgot something every single time. While the supermarket boomed outward across the new suburbs like a spreading oil stain of abundance and parking lots, something else was quietly dying. The neighbourhood grocer, small, independent, often family-owned, often with a name above the door that was also the family's name, was losing the war, had been losing it since the 1930s, when chain stores and self-service shopping began their long restructuring of American retail. But the 1950s were when the losses became unmistakable and the math became irreversible. The neighbourhood grocer could not match the supermarket's prices, not even close. The supermarket bought in quantities that allowed it to negotiate terms no small independent operator could access. The supermarket's cost for a case of Campbell's soup was lower than the neighbourhood grocer's cost for a case of Campbell's soup, which meant the supermarket's shelf price was lower, which meant the shopper who was managing a careful budget, and most shoppers were managing a careful budget, had a rational reason to drive past the neighbourhood grocer on her way to the supermarket. The math did not require sentiment to solve. The selection gap was equally damaging. The supermarket offered hundreds of products in every category. The neighbourhood grocer offered perhaps 40 feet of canned goods, a small produce section that received deliveries twice a week, a meat case that ran to perhaps 6 or 8 cuts, and a bread shelf that held 2 or 3 brands. It was enough. It had always been enough. But enough was a harder sell in an era that had decided abundance was the point. What the neighbourhood grocer had was what the supermarket could not replicate, and what the market was not yet valuing at full price. He knew his customers. This is not a small thing, or it was not then. He knew that Mrs. Kowalski's husband had been ill, and that she needed something easy to prepare. He knew that the family in the new house on Elm had 4 children and bought accordingly. He knew who was behind on their account and who always paid promptly and who needed a little grace at the end of the month when the money ran short. He extended credit, quietly, informally, in the manner of someone who understood that a customer in a temporary difficulty was still a customer, and that the kind of loyalty built by extending grace in hard times was the kind that lasted. The supermarket did not extend credit. The supermarket had a sign near the checkout that explained its payment policies, and those policies did not include the informal tab that the neighbourhood grocer kept in a ledger behind the counter, noted in pencil in handwriting that could be adjusted if circumstances required. Through the 1950s, small grocers closed in steady numbers. The storefronts became dry cleaners and insurance offices and hardware stores, and eventually the kinds of businesses that didn't require you to choose between them and the supermarket. The neighbourhoods that lost their grocer lost something that didn't have a clean name in 1953. It had a name later. Later, people called it community infrastructure, or food access, or the social fabric of the neighbourhood. At the time, most people called it Thursday and drove to the supermarket because the prices were better and the parking was free and the selection was broader, and all of those things were true and none of them captured everything that was being traded away. The 1950s were the golden age of processed food, and the word processed carried none of the baggage it carries now. There was no pause before saying it, no lowered voice, no implication that something had been done to the food that the food might not have consented to. Processed meant modern. Processed meant consistent. Processed meant that scientists in white coats in laboratories had thought about this more carefully than you had, and had arrived at a product that was reliable, safe, shelf-stable, and convenient in ways that fresh ingredients, with their seasonal limitations and tendency toward decay, and their refusal to be the same twice, simply were not. The post-war food industry had enormous resources, enormous ambition, and an American public that had just spent years living under wartime rationing and was prepared to embrace abundance in almost any form it arrived. The food companies understood this. They invested in research, in manufacturing, in the distribution networks that could move a product from a factory in New Jersey to a supermarket shelf in Iowa, and in the advertising that would convince the housewife in Iowa that the product deserved a place in her pantry. Cheese Whiz arrived in 1952. It was processed cheese spread in a jar, smooth, orange, consistent, capable of being applied to a cracker or a slice of bread or a vegetable without requiring any of the variable outcomes that came with actual cheese. It was not pretending to be cheese exactly. It was something adjacent to cheese that had solved several of cheese's more inconvenient characteristics. It did not mould. It didn't need to be sliced. It was always exactly the same. These were presented as advantages because they were advantages in a decade that valued reliability over complexity. Instant mashed potatoes, dehydrated potato flakes that reconstituted into something recognizable as mashed potatoes when hot water and butter were added, had appeared in the late 40s and were being enthusiastically adopted through the 50s by housewives who found in them one less thing to stand at the stove peeling and boiling. The result was not identical to homemade mashed potatoes. Everyone knew this. The family knew this. The housewife knew this. The product was purchased anyway because the family was fed and the extra 20 minutes belonged to someone now. Cake mixes had appeared earlier, but required careful psychological engineering before they took hold. The original formulations required only water. Everything was already in the mix, including the dried egg. But research found that housewives resisted these completely prepared mixes because they felt that adding only water was not cooking, was not contributing, was not earning the compliment that arrived when the cake was presented. So the manufacturers removed the dried egg from the mix and required the cook to add a fresh egg herself. One egg, Cracked, added, stirred. The result was exactly the same cake. The cook now felt she had made it. Sales improved dramatically. The 1950s food industry had accidentally discovered that people need to feel useful, even at the cost of minor inconvenience. This was not cynical, or rather, it was not only cynical. The processed food of the 1950s was solving genuine problems that genuine people had. It was also creating new dependencies and reshaping taste expectations in ways that would take decades to fully understand. Both of these things were true simultaneously, which is how most revolutions work. We must speak about Jello. There is no honest account of 1950s American food culture that does not eventually arrive at Jello, and no account of Jello that does not require a moment of genuine reckoning with what was happening and why everyone seemed perfectly fine with it. Jello had been around since the 1800s, but the 1950s were its absolute apex, the peak of its cultural dominance, the height of its formal ambition, the era in which it transcended its identity as a simple fruit-flavoured gelatin dessert and became something closer to a medium of domestic expression, a material, a canvas, a philosophy of entertaining. Jello was purchased in enormous quantities, sold in small cardboard boxes containing a packet of flavoured gelatin powder, priced at around 10 cents, available in enough flavours to create an entire weekly rotation: strawberry, raspberry, lime, lemon, orange, cherry, black cherry, grape. It was one of the most reliable items in the canned goods aisle, a fixture of every household's pantry alongside the Campbell soup and the Crisco. It was cheap. It was fast. It was, in its basic fruit and gelatin form, genuinely pleasant and quite refreshing, especially in summer, especially with whipped cream on top, especially when you were a child and had no interest in asking questions about the structural mechanics of your dessert. But the 1950s did not leave Jello as dessert. The 1950s had ambitions for Jello that extended far beyond the dessert course, and those ambitions produced results that require careful historical documentation. The Jello mould was the vehicle. A ring mould, a loaf pan, a decorative-shaped mould purchased from the houseware section of the department store. You prepared the Jello, you poured it into the mould, and then you added things to it. Fruit, initially, which was entirely reasonable. Canned fruit cocktail suspended in lime Jello, set in the refrigerator overnight, unmoulded onto a plate with practiced confidence. This was a legitimate dessert, attractive, refreshing, requiring more skill to present than to make. No one should be criticised for this. But then the vegetables entered the picture. Shredded carrots in orange Jello, sliced celery in lemon Jello, olives in lime Jello, which is a combination that suggests the person who invented it had experienced some kind of flavour perception event that they were trying to communicate to others. Cream cheese, whipped and folded through. Tuna fish, suspended in aspic alongside capers and hard-boiled egg. The savoury Jello mould was real. It was published in major women's magazines with full-colour photography. It was served at dinner parties and potlucks and church suppers and holiday tables, and the people who ate it did so without apparent distress. Understanding why requires understanding the era. The Jello mould demonstrated skill, the unmoulding required technique, and the presentation, when successful, was visually striking in a way that suggested the cook had invested thought and effort. It was modern, using a manufactured product in an inventive application. It was economical, incorporating inexpensive vegetables or canned ingredients into something that looked like it had required considerably more, and in a decade that valued consistency and control, there was something satisfying about a dish that held its shape, that could be prepared the day before, that arrived at the table exactly as intended with no last-minute variables. The Jello mould was the 1950s in edible form, optimistic, controlled, slightly strange in retrospect, and absolutely convinced of its own elegance. You could not make this up. You didn't have to. The women's magazines were doing it every month right there in print in full colour with suggested garnishes. The grocery trip did not end at the store. It ended at home, in the kitchen, with the putting away. Paper bags were placed on the counter, sometimes 2 or 3 of them, sometimes more, and the unpacking began with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this many times before and had strong opinions about where things went. This was not casual. There was a system, and the system had been developed over time through the accumulated experience of what happened when you deviated from it. Canned goods went to the pantry, organised by category, soups together, vegetables together, fruit together, because a pantry without organisation was a pantry where you bought a second can of cream of mushroom soup because you couldn't find the first one, and that was a waste of 20 cents and a small private failure of household management. Labels faced forward. This was not vanity. This was inventory control. Produce went to the refrigerator's crisper drawer, or to the counter if it was the kind of thing that kept better at room temperature. Tomatoes on the counter, always, because a refrigerated tomato lost something irreplaceable, and everyone who had made that mistake once did not make it twice. Bananas hung on the banana hook, which was a real object, a small chrome or ceramic hook designed specifically for the suspension of a banana bunch, purchased from the houseware section of the department store and treated as a perfectly ordinary kitchen accessory because it was. The banana hook has since been largely lost to history, but was, in the 1950s kitchen, as unremarkable as a pot holder. Bread went to the bread box. The bread box was another real object, a ventilated metal or wooden container that lived on the counter and maintained the specific environment that bread required to stay fresh without developing the particular despair of bread left in a bag on a warm counter. Bread in a bread box lasted longer. This was not magic. This was bread box technology, and it worked. And it was a point of order that bread went in the bread box and not somewhere else. The refrigerator was packed with the precision of a small logistical operation. Leftovers toward the front, where they could be seen and used rather than forgotten and discovered later in a state that raised questions. Dairy to one designated shelf, meat to the lower shelf, which was coldest, and which needed to stay coldest because meat spoiled fastest, and spoiled meat was both a health risk and a waste of the most expensive item in the weekly shop. Eggs in the egg compartment built into the refrigerator door, where they fit perfectly because someone had designed the refrigerator door with eggs in mind, which is the kind of domestic thoughtfulness that does not get celebrated, but absolutely should. The freezer was small. The freezer compartment of a 1950s household refrigerator was a fraction of what we now consider a normal freezer, a compact section at the top that held perhaps a few packages of meat, a can of frozen orange juice concentrate, and the current TV dinner if there was one. It was managed carefully because there was not room to manage it carelessly. Everything that went in was noted, mentally or literally, so that it could be found again without defrosting the whole unit to look for it. When the last bag was emptied and folded, and tucked into the drawer where the bags lived, because you kept the bags, because the bags were useful, because throwing away a perfectly functional paper bag was not something a sensible household did. The kitchen was restocked, the week was provisioned, and dinner was approximately 2 hours away. The shopping was finished. The work it made possible was just beginning. For all its gleaming abundance, the 1950s American supermarket had striking and sometimes startling gaps. Walk its aisles with a modern shopping list and you would be turned away, baffled, or simply staring at an empty space on the shelf where something you consider completely ordinary has not yet been invented, imported, or considered. Olive oil was available in some larger stores but understood as a specialty item, something found in the ethnic food section if the store had one. purchased primarily by families of Italian or Greek heritage, and used for purposes that the average Midwestern cookbook would have described as optional or not described at all. The dominant cooking fat was Crisco, solid vegetable shortening in a large tin, followed by butter, followed by lard, followed by the newly arriving margarine. Olive oil was not yet the universal kitchen medium it would become. It was a regional ingredient, an immigrant ingredient, not yet an American one. Garlic was present but treated with suspicion across a meaningful portion of the country. Cookbooks of the era sometimes called for a hint of garlic, or a small amount of garlic powder, if desired, the qualifier doing significant work, acknowledging that some readers might consider garlic a step too far. Fresh garlic was associated with immigrant kitchens, with Southern European cooking, with the kinds of flavours that some corners of American food culture regarded as aggressively foreign. Garlic powder was the compromise, the version of garlic that had been processed into American acceptability, tamed by the same industrial logic that had tamed everything else. Yogurt was barely present. It existed in limited form in health food stores in larger cities, consumed by people who were described in the general culture as health enthusiasts, in a way that carried mild implications of eccentricity. The mainstream supermarket did not carry yogurt. The mainstream supermarket would not carry yogurt for another 15 years or so, and even then it would take considerable further time before yogurt completed its journey from eccentric health food to item purchased in 12 packs. Avocados were a curiosity available in California and in specialty markets in a handful of other large cities. Their role in American cuisine was approximately zero outside of the Southwest. The concept of guacamole as a broadly known and broadly available food was decades away. If you describe to a 1953 housewife in Ohio the prevalence of avocado in the modern American diet, the avocado toast, the avocado in the salad, the avocado in the smoothie, the avocado as a lifestyle signifier, she would have several questions beginning with what an avocado was. The spice aisle was honest about its ambitions. Salt, black pepper, paprika, garlic powder, onion powder, celery salt, dried parsley, dried oregano increasingly as Italian-American cooking spread from its regional origins into the broader culture. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves for baking, chili powder in the Southwest. Beyond this, the spice rack thinned quickly. The extraordinary range of global spices that a modern supermarket carries, the sumac, the smoked paprika, the berber, the gochugaru, was simply absent. Not because the world didn't have them, because the 1950s American supermarket had not yet decided the world was relevant to the question of what went in a spice rack. What the supermarket offered was complete for the cooking it assumed you were doing. The problem was how narrow that assumption was and how confidently it was held. The supermarket was not merely a place of commerce. It was, in a meaningful and often underestimated sense, the town square of the post-war American suburb, the one place where the neighborhood made itself visible in an unplanned, low-stakes, genuinely democratic way. You went to the grocery store and you saw people, not the people you had arranged to see, not the people you had dressed up for or planned a conversation with, but the people who simply also needed groceries on Thursday morning. Your neighbor from 2 streets over, whose name you knew but whose life you didn't, examining the iceberg lettuce with more focus than iceberg lettuce has ever warranted. Your children's teacher, slightly disorienting in civilian clothes, holding a box of cereal that told you something small and unexpected about her private life. The woman from your church whose name you could not reliably remember, but whose face you could have drawn from memory you'd been sitting 6 pews apart every Sunday for 3 years, and you still weren't sure if it was Margaret or Marion, and this was not the moment to find out. The grocery store was where the social life of the neighborhood made itself visible without requiring an occasion. You didn't need a reason to be there. You didn't need to have planned a visit or issued an invitation. You were there because everyone was there, because groceries were a universal requirement, and the supermarket had collected that requirement under one roof, and in doing so had created a space where accidental community happened regularly and reliably. The encounter in the cereal aisle was its own particular social form, unhurried enough to have a real conversation, purposeful enough to end it without awkwardness, bounded by the shared understanding that you were both there to do something and would eventually need to do it. You could spend 20 minutes talking to someone you hadn't seen since the summer and part ways feeling genuinely reconnected, and neither of you had to commit to a dinner invitation that neither of you was entirely sure you wanted to keep. The cereal aisle conversation was perfect in its impermanence. The store staff were part of this social fabric in a way that supermarket employees are rarely part of it now. The cashier who had checked you out every Thursday for 2 years knew your approximate budget and your approximate family size and the approximate age of your children from watching what you bought. The produce man knew who was cooking for company this weekend from the quality of vegetables being selected. The butcher had opinions about your roasting choices and was not always keeping them to himself. These relationships were minor, commercial, and entirely real. They were the texture of a neighborhood, accumulated in small increments over many transactions. The grocery store was also, depending on your neighborhood, the place where certain social realities made themselves plain. Who you saw, who you didn't see, which aisles felt comfortable and which felt watched. These experiences varied significantly by race and class and neighborhood, in ways that the cheerful advertisements never acknowledged. The social life of the store was a mirror of the social life of the suburb, with all of that suburb's warmth and all of its limitations. But in the aisles where people moved freely, the grocery store offered something that the organized social events of the era, the dinner parties, the church suppers, the PTA meetings, could not quite offer. It offered the chance to be among your neighbours without performing for them, to simply exist in the same space, reaching for the same cans, comparing the same prices, all participating in the same ordinary project of keeping a household going. That was not nothing. In many ways, it was quite a lot. The 1950s supermarket advertisements painted a world that was uniformly cheerful, uniformly prosperous, and uniformly white. Smiling women in clean aprons, gleaming kitchen floors, children who received their TV dinners with expressions of uncomplicated delight. The advertisements were aspirational documents, and the aspiration they depicted was specific. It belonged to a particular version of America, and it was very clear about who was invited to inhabit it. The real grocery landscape of 1950s America was rather different, and to tell the story of this era's shopping without acknowledging that difference is to tell only the story the advertisements wanted told, which is not the same thing as the story that actually happened. Black Americans in the 1950s, in the South explicitly and by law, in the North implicitly and by practice, navigated a grocery landscape that was separate, unequal, and in many cases deliberately hostile. In the Jim Crow South, the separation was codified. Separate entrances, separate service windows, stores where black customers were served last, served poorly, served in ways designed to communicate their position in the social order as clearly and as constantly as possible. The gleaming supermarket of the advertisements was, in many southern towns, a place that black shoppers could enter only on particular terms, or could not enter at all. In the North, the exclusion was less formal and no less real. Residential segregation, enforced through restrictive covenants, through the lending practices of banks, through the coordinated decisions of real estate agents and developers, had concentrated black families in specific urban neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods were systematically underserved by the major supermarket chains that were expanding rapidly through the suburbs. The new supermarkets followed the new suburbs, and the new suburbs were built with explicit and legally enforced intention for white families. The grocery store followed the housing, and the housing excluded. What this meant in practice was that black neighbourhoods were served by smaller stores, with fewer products and higher prices. The cost of food for a black family in a segregated northern neighbourhood was measurably higher than the cost of the same food for a white family in the suburbs, because the competitive pressure of the large supermarket was absent, because the buying power of the chain was absent, because the refrigeration and storage infrastructure that kept prices down at the supermarket was absent. This was not a coincidence. It was the grocery store expression of a set of policies and practices that pervaded every dimension of American economic life. Black-owned grocery stores served their communities with a dignity and a resourcefulness that the mainstream chains withheld. They extended credit. They knew their customers. They stocked the ingredients that their customers actually cooked with, the mustard greens and the salt pork and the black-eyed peas and the hot sauce, rather than the ingredients that the mainstream food culture had decided were universal. They were businesses, and they were also anchors, the kind of institution that a neighbourhood organised itself around, that people trusted because the person behind the counter had a stake in the same community they were serving. The grocery store in the 1950s was a mirror of everything else in American society. Its abundance and its deliberate withholding of that abundance, its modernity and its stubborn insistence on maintaining ancient hierarchies inside modern packaging. The jello was the same colour on every shelf. The access to the shelf was not. The grocery trip ended, and dinner had not cooked itself. This is the detail that gets lost in the warm amber light of nostalgia, the detail that the vintage advertisements with their smiling women and gleaming surfaces consistently and deliberately omitted, that the weekly shop was the beginning of the work, not the end of it. Coming home with 3 bags of groceries at 2 in the afternoon meant that you had approximately 2 hours before people started arriving home hungry, and the cooking still needed to happen. And the cooking was not optional, and there was no one coming to help with it. The 1950s kitchen was better equipped than its predecessors: a gas or electric stove with reliable temperature control, a refrigerator that maintained cold without manual ice delivery, perhaps a stand mixer on the counter if the household had been fortunate enough to accumulate the trading stamps required to claim one. These were genuine improvements. They did not make dinner cook itself. Things still needed to be peeled and chopped and browned and watched. The roast that looked simple on the recipe card still needed to go into the oven at the right temperature at the right time to be ready when dinner was supposed to happen, and the right time required working backward from when the family would be hungry, which required knowing when they would arrive home, which required holding a schedule in your head that belonged to other people. The casserole still needed assembly. The salad still needed to be washed and torn and dressed. The potatoes, unless they were the instant kind, and sometimes they were the instant kind, and sometimes that was the right call, and sometimes it felt like a small defeat, still needed to be peeled and boiled and mashed. And the mashing required a hand masher and elbow grease, and a decision about how much butter, and whether anyone would notice if it was margarine. Dinner in the 1950s was not ordered from an app. It was not assembled from a meal kit with pre-measured ingredients and laminated instructions. It was not picked up on the way home from somewhere that had already cooked it. It was made from ingredients in a kitchen by a person who had also shopped for those ingredients earlier that day, and who was now standing at a stove while other members of the household sat in the living room watching television. This is not presented as complaint. The women who did this work were not, for the most part, presenting it as complaint either. Or rather, they were not presenting it at all, because the cultural vocabulary for presenting it did not yet exist, and the cultural permission to present it was even further away. They were simply doing what needed doing in the time available, with the resources on hand, with the accumulated skill of someone who had done it enough times that it had become automatic. The timing, the temperatures, the order of operations without becoming easy. The shopping cart had been full, the bags had been heavy, the refrigerator was stocked, the pantry was organised, the bread was in the bread box and the eggs were in the egg compartment and the canned goods faced forward on the pantry shelf. Dinner was 40 minutes away. The list for next week was already beginning to assemble itself quietly in the back of her mind, because the list was always beginning, because the household never stopped needing things, because the work was continuous in the specific way that invisible work always is. It ended only long enough to start again. There is a way in which the 1950s supermarket was the American dream made tangible, the post-war promise of prosperity made edible, sellable and stackable on shelves that ran the full length of a building, the size of something that would have seemed extraordinary to a person who had lived through the Depression. The full shelves were not just full shelves, they were evidence that the system had worked, that the sacrifice had been worthwhile, that the country had emerged from 15 years of depression and war into something that looked unmistakably like abundance. A generation that had rationed butter and sugar and meat, that had kept the ration books and made the substitutions and told the children that powdered eggs were just as good, and the children had known this was not true and had not said so, was now standing in a store where butter was available in unlimited quantities at 70 cents a pound, and no one was checking your ration book because there was no ration book, because the war was over, and this was what winning looked like. The supermarket participated in a national mythology that the decade was actively constructing about itself. The idea that America had arrived somewhere, that the long, difficult journey from deprivation to prosperity was complete, that the life being built in the new suburbs with the new cars and the new appliances and the new supermarkets was the destination that history had been moving toward. The full cart was proof of arrival. The brand name soup was proof of arrival. The TV dinner in the freezer case was proof of arrival, because arrival meant having options, and options meant freedom, and freedom was the word the decade used most to describe itself. This was not entirely myth. Compared to what most people in most countries were eating in 1953, compared to post-war Europe still managing scarcity, compared to the Soviet Union's grocery stores which were reliably understocked, compared to the vast portions of the world where the problem of feeding a family was genuinely urgent in ways that had nothing to do with coupon strategy, the American supermarket was a genuine, remarkable achievement of productive capacity and distribution infrastructure. The mythology was built on something real, but the mythology required careful editing. It required not looking at the neighborhoods that the new supermarkets had not followed. It required not examining too closely the budget math of the families for whom the full cart was a source of anxiety rather than satisfaction. It required treating the particular model of the household that the supermarket was designed to serve, the suburban house, the single male income, the woman who shopped and cooked, as universal rather than as one specific arrangement among many possible arrangements, an arrangement that worked for some people and not for others, and was maintained in part by the active exclusion of alternatives. The American dream stocked on a shelf was real, and it was partial, and it was genuinely wondrous, and it was genuinely unequal, and all of these things were true at the same time, which is more or less the situation with American dreams generally. You could push your cart through the aisles and feel the abundance and feel grateful for it, and still understand, if you were paying attention, that not everyone was pushing a cart through the same aisles. The cereal was excellent, though. The cereal, in all its sugared, mascot-festooned glory, was genuinely excellent. If you wanted to understand the 1950s without reading a single history book, you could do considerably worse than reading the grocery lists. The grocery list is a primary document, unself-conscious, unperformed, written for no audience except the person going to the store. It records what a household consumed, what it valued, what it could afford, what it worried running short of. It is the most honest document a household produces because no one writes a grocery list for posterity. A grocery list from 1953 might read, milk, butter, eggs, Wonder Bread, ground beef, canned peas, Campbell's cream of mushroom, Crisco, Folgers, jello, sugar, flour, American cheese, bologna, a fryer chicken if it's on sale. These items together paint a portrait of a household that cooked from scratch but welcomed industrial assistance, that used fat as a fundamental ingredient rather than a cautious addition, that valued reliability over adventure, that maintained a pantry as an operating system rather than a collection of impulse purchases. The chicken qualifier is worth pausing on. If it's on sale. 4 words that carry the entire weight of the household budget in a single condition. The chicken was wanted. The chicken was planned for. But the chicken was conditional, subject to the price at the store that day, and the person writing the list knew this and wrote it into the list as a note to herself, a reminder that the decision would be made at the store in real time based on what the tag said, and that dinner would adjust accordingly if the price was wrong. Historians who study material culture prize grocery lists for exactly this quality of unguarded honesty. The dinner party menu is aspirational. It shows you what a household wanted to project. The grocery list shows you what the household actually ran on. The casserole was made of the things on the list. The birthday cake was made of the things on the list. The Tuesday dinner and the Sunday roast and the school lunches and the after-school snack all trace back to the list, to the store, to the woman with the pencil at the kitchen table on Wednesday night who was solving the week's food problem in advance, because solving it in advance was the only way it got solved at all. The prices penciled beside, items on surviving grocery lists from the era are their own kind of time capsule. Coffee, 89 cents. Butter, 72 cents. A dozen eggs, 58 cents. Ground beef, per pound, 53 cents. These numbers look small until you remember the paycheck they came out of, and then they look exactly right. Modest. Familiar. The prices of things that people bought every week because they had to, budgeted carefully because they needed to, and considered normal because they were normal. The grocery list also reveals what was absent. No fresh herbs, no specialty cheese, no wine, no avocado, no item that required explanation or instruction. The list describes a cuisine that knew what it was and had decided that was enough, that the goal was competent, reliable, affordable, complete, not exceptional, not adventurous, complete. And in 1953, with the Depression still in living memory, and the war not quite a decade behind, complete was not a low bar. Complete was the whole point. The 1950s supermarket was not a destination. It was a stage in a transformation that the decade itself had launched, without fully understanding where it was going, building momentum that would carry the American grocery store into forms that its 1953 architects could not have predicted and might not have recognized. The stores were already growing by the end of the decade, and the growth was accelerating. Bigger parking lots, wider aisles, more products in every category, not just more brands of the same thing, but genuinely new categories of thing. Whole sections of the store that hadn't existed in 1953 and would be fixtures by 1963. The frozen foods case was expanding from a single row of freezers into an entire zone. Prepared foods were multiplying. The produce section was beginning to receive refrigeration that allowed it to stock things that wouldn't have survived a day in the ambient temperature of the early stores. The health food movement was gathering at the edges, quiet, marginal, regarded with the same mild suspicion as yogurt, but gathering. There were people in 1958 who were reading about nutrition in ways that contradicted what the Campbell's advertisement had implied, who were questioning whether the amount of sugar in a bowl of Sugar Smacks was a feature or a problem, who were beginning to think about what processed food was and what the processing removed along with the inconvenience. They were not yet a market. They were not yet numerous enough to stock a shelf for, but they were there. The civil rights movement was in open confrontation with the segregation that defined so many retail spaces and so many residential neighborhoods and so many aspects of American economic life. The freedom rides and the lunch counter sit-ins were also, in their way, about grocery stores, about who had access to the abundance the country was producing, and on what terms. The supermarket's cheerful advertisements were going to have to contend with a country that was insisting on asking the questions the advertisements had been designed to prevent. The housewife who did all the shopping was reading Betty Friedan, or would be reading her by 1963, and was beginning to articulate, cautiously at first, then with increasing clarity, the feeling that the domestic role the supermarket assumed she was playing was not the whole of what she wanted from her life. The cart and the list and the budget and the dinner and the shopping day were not disappearing. But the unquestioned naturalness of her exclusive ownership of them was beginning to erode. By the mid-1960s, the store that had seemed so modern in 1953 already felt slightly out of date, the way things do when the world around them changes faster than they can keep up. The cereal mascots were still there. The jello was still there. The bread box at home was starting to gather dust as plastic bags and refrigeration made it unnecessary. The TV dinner was proliferating into dozens of varieties. The world was moving, as it always moves, forward, sideways, in directions that look inevitable in retrospect, and looked like nothing in particular on a Thursday morning in the canned goods aisle of a supermarket in 1953. Here is a strange and slightly uncomfortable thing to sit with. Some of what defined grocery shopping in the 1950s was genuinely good, and we have lost some of it, and the loss is real even when the thing we lost came packaged with things that were not good and that we are not sorry to have left behind. Not the limitations, not the racial segregation and the systematic exclusion and the deliberate underservice of entire communities. Not the relentless, unacknowledged pressure on women to perform a domestic role without recognition or relief. Not the jello with the olives in it. Those things are gone, and good. Riddance and the story of how they went is one of the better stories in American social history. But something else went with them. Something that doesn't have a clean name, but that people who remember it describe with a particular kind of wistfulness that is different from ordinary nostalgia. Not the wistfulness for youth or for simplicity, but the wistfulness for something that was genuinely lost rather than merely superseded. The butcher who knew your name, not as a data point in a loyalty program, not as a username attached to a purchase history in a database. Your actual name, known because he had said it out loud on 100 Thursday mornings, because your family had been coming to his counter since before your youngest was born, because knowing your name was part of what made him good at his job, and good at his job was something he cared about. The produce man who told you the tomatoes weren't worth buying this week and to come back Thursday, the cashier who asked after your mother without being trained to ask after your mother. These were the relationships that the neighbourhood grocer had, and that the supermarket imitated imperfectly, and that the modern grocery experience has largely stopped imitating. The self-checkout machine does not know your name. The app does not tell you the tomatoes are wrong this week. The store is larger and less intimate and designed more precisely and staffed more thinly, and the efficiency gains are real, and the convenience gains are real, and something else is also real, something that lives in the gap between transaction and relationship that the 1950s store at its best managed to bridge. There was also the deliberateness. The weekly shop as an event planned for, prepared for, executed with intention. Not the continuous low-grade supply chain management that modern grocery shopping has become. The daily app check, the same-day delivery, the perpetual minor restocking of a kitchen that never quite runs out of anything and never quite feels fully stocked. The 1950s shopper made one trip. She planned for it. She was present for it in a way that the distributed modern grocery experience does not quite ask of anyone. Whether any of this is worth the cost it came at is a question the era itself cannot answer for us. The cost was real, and it was borne by specific people in specific and unequal ways, and romanticising the experience means, at minimum, being honest about who was paying for it and what it was costing them. But the thing that was good was also good, and the people who felt its loss as the supermarket grew larger and more transactional and more perfectly engineered were not wrong about what they were feeling. They were just feeling something real, the way people always feel something real when a place that knew their name becomes a place that doesn't. The last item has been rung up. The bags are in the trunk. The receipt is folded into a pocket or lost already, tucked somewhere between the car seat and the door panel where small things go to become somebody else's problem. The week is stocked. The family will be fed, and somewhere in a house that smells like percolated coffee and something beginning to warm in the oven, a woman in 1953 is putting away the groceries. She's doing it with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this hundreds of times. She knows where everything goes without looking. The canned goods go to the pantry in their categories, labels forward. The meat goes to the lower shelf of the refrigerator, wrapped in its white butcher paper, labelled in grease pencil in handwriting she has learned to read. The bread goes in the bread box. The eggs go in the egg compartment. The Folgers goes in the cabinet above the stove where the coffee always lives, because the coffee always lives there, and has always lived there, and will always live there, and there is a specific satisfaction in the reliability of this, the small permanence of knowing exactly where things are. She doesn't know what's coming. She doesn't know that in 20 years the store she shops at will be twice the size and carry 200 kinds of cereal and a section of the store dedicated entirely to foods from countries she has never heard of. She doesn't know that her daughter will someday order groceries from a device she carries in her pocket and have them delivered to her door by a person she will never meet, in a transaction that will take 30 seconds and require no driving and no list and no waiting in line and no conversation with anyone, ever. She doesn't know about the avocado. Nobody in 1953 knows about the avocado. She closes the refrigerator. She folds the last paper bag and adds it to the drawer where the bags live, because the bags are useful, because things that are useful are kept, because waste is a choice that circumstances have made difficult and habit has made unthinkable. She starts the coffee. She checks the clock. She begins to think about dinner, which is already underway in the back of her mind, where it has been running quietly since she woke up this morning. She's driven to the store and pushed the cart and managed the budget and compared the prices and clipped the coupons and carried the bags and put everything away, and she will cook dinner and clean up after. And the day will continue and none of this will be commented upon because it is Tuesday, and this is simply what Tuesday requires. But here, tonight, let's comment upon it. Let's name it. Let's hold for just a moment the ordinary, invisible, relentless competence of someone who kept a household running on a precise budget in a store designed to exceed that budget, who fed her family well enough that the children grew, and the husband didn't notice the effort, and the neighbours didn't notice the effort, and nobody noticed the effort, which was the exact and only measure of success the era offered her. Your kitchen, right now, is a miracle. Your refrigerator holds more food than a medieval village could have imagined. Your grocery store stocks ingredients from every inhabited corner of the planet. Your budget, whatever it is, buys more variety and safety and nutritional range than any amount of money could have bought in 1953. The woman in that kitchen in that decade didn't have any of that. She had a list and a budget and a car with no seatbelts and a bread box, and she made it work every single week. That is, quietly and without fanfare, remarkable. Let's talk about the pharmacist. Because tucked into the corner of many 1950s supermarkets, past the canned goods, past the dairy case, somewhere between the household cleaning products and the greeting cards, was a small, slightly elevated counter, staffed by a man in a white coat who was not a doctor, but was, for a significant portion of the American population, the closest thing to one that they consulted on a regular basis. The pharmacy counter inside the supermarket was a 1950s innovation that made a particular kind of sense in a particular kind of way. The supermarket was already the one-stop destination for the household's food supply. Adding a pharmacy meant it could also be the one-stop destination for the household's health supply, the aspirin and the cold remedies and the vitamins and the cough syrup and the bandages and the antacids and whatever else the week required in the way of minor medical management. One trip, one parking lot, everything in the same building. The logic was clean. The pharmacist himself occupied a specific and slightly elevated social position in the 1950s neighbourhood. He had a professional degree in a white coat and a counter that was raised a few inches above the floor of the store, which was a small architectural statement about the nature of the consultation. You approached him from below slightly, he looked down at you slightly. This was not accidental. This was the spatial grammar of expertise, and the 1950s understood it fluently. He dispensed prescriptions when prescriptions were what you needed, but he also dispensed advice, which was freely given, specific, and delivered with the confident authority of someone who'd been answering the same questions for 20 years and had strong opinions about the answers. You described your symptoms, the cough, the headache, the child's ear that had been troubling her since Tuesday, and he recommended a product. Not tentatively, not with the hedged, liability-conscious language of the modern pharmacist, who will tell you to consult a physician for anything more complex than a hangnail. He told you what to buy, how much to take, and when you should expect to feel better. This was enormously valuable to families who could not afford a doctor visit for every minor ailment, which was most families. A doctor visit in the 1950s cost money, real money, the kind that came out of the grocery budget if there wasn't a separate budget for it, which there often wasn't. The pharmacist was the triage layer between the family medicine cabinet and the physician's office, and he performed that role with a directness and accessibility that the formal medical system could not match. The products on the shelves behind him and along the adjacent aisles were the full range of 1950s patent medicine culture. Brill Cream and Vitalis for the men, Pond's Cold Cream and Tangy Lipstick for the women, Ipeana toothpaste for the children with the beaver on the label, who was very concerned about your dental hygiene, Milk of Magnesia in its iconic blue glass bottle, Hadacol Tonic, which contained a remarkable 12% alcohol and was marketed as a vitamin supplement. There were vitamins in abundance. The 1950s were enormously enthusiastic about vitamins, which were modern and scientific and available in cheerful orange-flavoured chewable form for children. Feminine hygiene products occupied a section of the pharmacy aisle that required a specific kind of navigation, found, retrieved, placed in the cart, covered by something else before proceeding to the checkout, paid for without extended conversation, bagged discreetly. This was the protocol. It was understood. Nobody described it or examined it. It simply operated every week in pharmacies across the country, as efficiently and as silently as any other unspoken social agreement of the era. The pharmacist knew what you bought. He knew what the family took for colds and what your husband took for his back, and how often the aspirin was running out, which told him something about the household's general stress levels that he filed away without comment. He was, in his quiet corner of the supermarket, one of the most comprehensively informed people in the neighbourhood. He kept everything he knew to himself. This was also part of the job. Let's talk about holiday shopping. Not the gift-buying kind, the food kind. The specific annual quietly catastrophic event of trying to buy groceries for Thanksgiving or Christmas in 1950s America, when every single household in the country decided simultaneously that this was the week they needed a turkey, and the supermarket, which had been perfectly adequate for every other Thursday of the year, suddenly revealed its limits with startling clarity. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were their own season within a season. The supermarket transformed itself, end caps loaded with stuffing mix and canned cranberry sauce, pyramids of canned pumpkin stacked near the checkout, a display of pie shells in the bakery section that had not existed the week before and would not exist the week after. The store was signalling loudly and commercially that a particular kind of cooking was about to be required, and that the particular kind of cooking required particular products, and that those products were, conveniently, all available right now in this building for a limited time. The turkey was the centerpiece and the source of the anxiety. In the early 1950s, fresh turkeys were the standard, purchased from a butcher or a farm stand or, in rural areas, possibly raised yourself, which introduced a layer of emotional complication that frozen turkeys neatly eliminated. Frozen turkeys arrived and were adopted with enthusiasm, because a frozen turkey solved the freshness problem and the timing problem simultaneously. You could buy it a week in advance. You could put it in the chest freezer in the garage. You could stop worrying about availability. Except that frozen turkeys needed to thaw, and the instructions for thawing were interpreted loosely by a significant portion of the American population, and the results of thawing a 20-pound turkey incorrectly were the kind of results that did not announce themselves until the turkey was already in the oven and the guests were already in the living room. The 1950s. Thanksgiving dinner produced by a partially thawed turkey, cooked at the wrong temperature for the wrong amount of time, was a specific kind of disaster. Technically edible in the way that a lot of technically edible things are technically edible, which is to say, you eat it, you don't call it good, and you don't bring it up again until someone else brings it up at Christmas. The shopping trip in the week before Thanksgiving was a contact sport. The store was crowded in ways it was not crowded on ordinary Thursdays. Women who had never made eye contact in the produce section were now standing side by side at the canned pumpkin display with an expression of focused intensity, because the canned pumpkin situation was uncertain and the pie was not optional. The celery was going fast. The onions were fine. The butter, always the butter, was moving at an alarming rate, and the store had not ordered enough of it and the shelf was showing gaps by Wednesday afternoon. A Thanksgiving without enough butter was a problem that no amount of margarine was going to solve, and everybody in the store understood this without needing to say so. Christmas brought its own grocery theatre. The ham versus the roast beef debate, conducted internally and with great seriousness. The fruitcake purchased not because anyone particularly wanted fruitcake, but because fruitcake had been present at Christmas for long enough that its absence would require explanation. The eggnog in the dairy case, available only for 6 weeks a year, consumed with a seasonal enthusiasm that would have been difficult to justify for any other beverage combining eggs, cream, sugar, and nutmeg in those particular proportions. The holidays made visible something that the ordinary weekly shop kept invisible. How much of the culture's identity was organised around food? How much the table was the event rather than just its setting? How much the grocery store was the starting point for things that mattered enormously to people? Every year, without fail, more butter than anyone had remembered to buy, every single year. Let's talk about what happened when children came along. Because children came along, especially in the 1950s when the average family had 3 or 4 of them, and the grocery trip was a weekly necessity and childcare was not something you arranged. It was something you were, continuously, in addition to everything else you were managing at the same time. A child in a 1950s supermarket was a variable, and variables complicate logistics. You arrived at the store with a list and a budget and an intention of moving through the aisles with efficient purpose, and you arrived also with a 4-year-old who had spotted the cereal aisle from the parking lot and had been waiting since the produce section to make his case for the box with the prize inside. The cart helped, up to a point. The fold-down seat at the front of the shopping cart was designed for exactly this situation. The small child who needed to be contained without being excluded, who could be strapped in facing forward and kept occupied by the passing scenery of the store while the shopping happened around them. This worked reliably for children under approximately 3 years old. After 3, the child had opinions about the scenery and the full respiratory capacity to express them. The cereal aisle was the battlefield. Both sides understood this going in. The mother had her route through it mapped, had her specific cereal or two already on the list, and had every intention of collecting them and moving on without lingering. The child had been watching the Saturday morning television advertisements for this specific aisle since January. The child knew exactly which box contained the decoder ring. The child had intelligence and preparation and nothing but time on their hands. The negotiation that followed was one of the recurring small dramas of 1950s domestic life, a careful calibration of parental authority against the reality that the cereal box was 43 cents. The decoder ring would buy 45 minutes of peace, and the walk back to the car was happening regardless of outcome. Some mothers held firm every time on principle, because holding firm on cereal established a precedent that paid dividends in larger negotiations later. Some mothers bought the cereal because 43 cents was 43 cents, and the principle could survive one Tuesday. Both strategies were entirely reasonable. Both were deployed in the same store on the same Thursday morning, one aisle apart by women who had both thought about this more than the situation seemed to warrant. The candy display near the checkout was positioned there deliberately, as we have already established, at exactly child hand height, within easy reach of a child who had been patient for 40 minutes and was now standing at the finish line of the shopping trip next to a tower of Tootsie Rolls that were a nickel each. The store designer who made this decision had either a deep sympathy for the plight of the shopping-tired child or a complete indifference to the plight of the shopping-tired mother, and the historical record does not clearly establish which. Children also served as small, unreliable assistants on the shopping trip, sent to retrieve items from lower shelves, asked to hold things that needed holding, occasionally trusted with reading the list aloud, a role that functioned well when the child could read and considerably less well when the child was interpreting the list with creative latitude. A child sent to get the soup returned with whichever can had the most compelling label art, which was not always the soup on the list, and was on at least one recorded occasion a can of dog food, which raised questions that nobody in the household had been prepared to answer. The children who made those weekly trips, with their mothers in the 1950s, grew up, had their own families, and found themselves in the cereal aisle again, this time on the other side of the negotiation. They knew every move the child was making. They had invented most of those moves. They bought the cereal anyway, because 43 cents was still 43 cents, and some lessons take a generation to fully appreciate, and some don't take at all. So tonight you have walked the aisles of 1950s America. You have pushed the cart with its rattling wheels past the canned goods and the frozen foods and the cereal boxes, with their enormous, cheerful mascots staring straight at you. You have stood at the butcher counter and the deli counter and negotiated the produce section with your bare hands and your best judgment. You have clipped the coupons and managed the budget and licked the trading stamps and waited for the mechanical cash register to deliver its verdict in loud, clacking numbers. You have survived. The cereal aisle with a 4-year-old. That last one, frankly, deserves its own medal. These were ordinary people living ordinary weeks. There was nothing dramatic about Tuesday's ground beef, or Thursday's canned peas, or the jello mould setting overnight in the refrigerator for the company that was coming Saturday. And yet there was something in it, in the sheer, sustained effort of feeding a family carefully and completely, week after week, on a budget that asked you to be precise, that deserves more than the soft-focused nostalgia the era usually receives. The women who pushed those carts were doing something real. They were keeping households running on mathematics they performed in their heads, in their sleep, at the kitchen table on Wednesday nights with a stubby pencil and a list that had to be right. They were making decisions, hundreds of small, consequential decisions every single week, that the culture around them refused to call decisions, refused to call work, refused to call skill. It just called it Tuesday. And the neighbourhood grocer who stayed open when the supermarket was closed, who extended credit when the month ran short, who knew your family by name and by what they ate, he was holding something together too. Something that didn't have a line item in any ledger, but that neighbourhoods felt when it was gone, and couldn't quite explain why the absence felt like more than just inconvenience. Even the children, standing in the cereal aisle with their decoder ring ambitions and their Saturday morning television education, they were learning something. They were learning that food was a negotiation, that abundance had a price, that some things on the list were certain and some things were conditional, and the difference mattered, and that the person who kept track of the difference was usually the one pushing the cart. History is not always war and politics and the decisions of powerful people in important rooms. Sometimes it is a woman in a cardigan, in a parking lot in 1953, loading paper bags into the trunk of a two-tone Buick, reorganizing the bread so it sits on top, checking that the eggs survived the journey, and starting the car for the drive home. That was history too. Quiet, unglamorous, indispensable history. The kind that fed everyone. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your warm house with your full refrigerator and your grocery app, and your complete indifference to the seasonal availability of avocados, maybe say a quiet thank you. To the women who made the list and drove the car and managed the budget and put dinner on the table without ever being asked if they found it interesting. To the butcher who learned your name. To the neighbourhood grocer who kept the lights on one more year. To the child who ate the bologna sandwich every single day without complaint and grew up and made their own list and went to the same store and did it all again. Because the 1950s were imperfect and unequal and strange in ways that took decades to fully understand, but the people in them were stubborn and resourceful and quietly extraordinary in the ways that ordinary people always are when the week requires it. The bread box is empty now. The trading stamps are gone. The grease pencil handwriting on the white butcher paper has long since faded. But somebody fed everybody, every single week, and that was enough to build a world on. Good night.